Hello and welcome to the Chengdu Gaming Federation podcast. My name is Charlie and I'm joined here by a guest who joined me on a recent podcast named Ryan, where we spoke about the development of his independent game, which is titled Carrier Commander. In the most recent podcast, we talked about a subject which we wanted to get in a little bit more deeply today, which is artificial intelligence in games. What's up? Welcome.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. I'm almost a regular or co-host on this podcast at this point.
I think you are. I mean, we've been going down an interesting road of independent development discussions, and you're a perfect guest to talk about that with, since you've been embarking on this now 2+ year journey to develop your first independent game. And you've learned so much through this process. And you've also done such a good job chronicling a lot of the things you've been going through on your blog, which I understand you just got a domain for. So that's great.
Yeah, thanks. That was your idea. From gametobrain.com.
From gametobrain.com.
I just feel so much more real now that it's not .blogspot.com.
You're legit. You're there.
Yeah, I wanted to start off with a little tidbit, little interesting thing I learned on my AI kind of research journey. And that is the AI of Pacman. Basically, every single level of Pacman has the same AI. I think most people don't realize that this classic game has such a simple AI that just ended up being one of the most classic games of all time. So in Pac-Man...
When you say AI in Pac-Man, by the way, just to clarify, you mean the movement of the ghosts? Is that correct?
Yes, the ghosts,
right.
The enemy characters. So in Pac-Man, there are 4 ghosts, 3 ghosts.
Sounds right.
One ghost always turns left. One ghost always turns right. One ghost always turns a random direction. And the last ghost always turns towards the player.
Oh, wow.
So a simple rule set like this, and let's say there was only one ghost. The player would figure out very quickly that one ghost always turned left, right?
Right.
But because you have all these different ghosts and each by a different rule set in the play space, the player never really... I mean, decades of people playing Pac-Man, and I've never heard anybody mention this.
I've never heard that either.
You don't notice it when you're playing the game, but the ghosts all follow a very predictable cycle, and there's only one of them that's actually reacting to your input as the player, the smart ghost.
That's really fascinating. That's a good example of what we were talking about recently, which was kind of in the discussion which led up to this podcast, which was the behavioral tree, which is programming different paths of behavior for artificial intelligence. And in our discussion, we talked about how many of the nodes which are on this tree, which compose the behavioral movement of the characters, are very simple. So like the ones you just described, for a ghost which always turns left or always turns right, I mean, it's so simple. It's not going to fool anybody. But if you include other behavioral modes within that, then it can become difficult enough to understand that you can't decipher it, that it creates the illusion of being intelligent.
Right, yeah. Kind of simulated complexity by just having a lot of entities.
Do you think that high-level Pac-Man players are identifying which is the ghost which turns left, which was the one that turns right, and they're just focusing on other ones? Or I wonder if that becomes part of the high-level strategy.
They must.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's only one ghost that you really, really need to worry about.
Right.
The smart ghost.
Right. That'd be a good like game name or blog name, the Smart Ghost.
The smart ghost.
A game AI podcast.
You know, I think the Pac-Man example, it brings up a lot of interesting points about AI. One of the first things I learned programming AI for my strategy game was that game AI needs to be fun. That's the most important part. It doesn't need to be realistic. It doesn't need to be smart. The most important thing is that it's fun. Can you imagine if all 4 ghosts were a smart ghost? They would annihilate you.
Sure.
Yeah, so making the AI just a little bit dumber makes the game more accessible to players.
It also makes it so easy to program. I mean, there's really only one ghost that you are really programming, right? I mean, the others are just kind of going on autopilot.
Right. There's only one reactionary ghost. So I think game AI should be fun. It's probably the most important thing that we can say on this podcast. It's kind of the foundation for all game AI design. And to bring that up, you probably also need to make a distinction between AI and gaming AI, because they're very different.
Yeah, sure. I looked up the definition of artificial intelligence just so we can start with a clear understanding of what exactly that is.
Yeah, sure.
Artificial intelligence is an area of computer science that emphasizes the creation of intelligent machines that work and react like humans. Some of the activities computers with artificial intelligence are designed for include speech recognition, learning, planning, and problem solving. And there's a really lengthy Wikipedia article on artificial intelligence, as you would expect. But what I didn't expect is that there's a very lengthy article on artificial intelligence in video games.
Right. And they're different articles, right? Because
Totally different.
game AI is not AI. They're different.
Yeah, it's fascinating that artificial intelligence in video games is not a subcategory of artificial intelligence. It's its own field of Wikipedia, at least.
Yeah. And we'll discuss a lot of the differences later. But once again, the most important part of a game AI is that it's fun. And that's probably the most important distinction.
One of the things which you mentioned, which is interesting, is that the objective of AI is not to be intelligent or to respond exactly like a human. And some have argued, I learned this just not long ago, that some specifically within the field of artificial intelligence argue that game AI is not actually artificial intelligence. It's just an advertising buzzword used to describe computer programs that are using simple sorting and matching algorithms to create the illusion of intelligent behavior.
Yeah, the term AI for gaming, when did that come about? The 80s, 90s, at a time when real AI was not very advanced.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think maybe around the time of Pacman, like 1970s, something like that. Although in the historical section of the artificial intelligence in video games article, it mentions how the real inception is the 1950s, which is sort of the very, very beginning of games. But I guess it really comes back to what is artificial intelligence in games exactly? Is it just programming a simple path to create this illusion? Does that qualify as artificial intelligence? There may be some area open to interpretation there.
Yeah, I would like to offer an altered definition of gaming AI is that it's not trying to simulate intelligence as much as it's trying to simulate players. It's trying to simulate the experience of playing with other players.
Mm-hmm.
So, talking about the specifics of AI, I wanted to just kind of break down some of the fundamentals of designing game AI, how that works in different games.
Let's start with Carrier Commander, because we talked about this at pretty great length in the last podcast, which we recorded. And in that one, you mentioned AI was one of the areas where you didn't foresee as much work as you actually had to do. So you were kind of in a situation where that was sort of, as I understand it, one of the most difficult challenges which you faced in the development of Carrier Commander. And can you describe what that problem was like, or what you thought about artificial intelligence before you got into that development project, and sort of what would you describe that experience as?
Sure. In Carrier Commander, which is a strategy game, so it's using kind of an advanced AI, not something you'd find in like Pac-Man. Each level, there's 21 levels. Each level has its own custom AI. And from the beginning to the end, it kind of walks you through my journey of learning how to make AI as a developer. Because the beginning stages, the AI is very simple. It's either pattern based, and then a little bit later on, it's a little bit reactionary, where I say if the player does this, then do this. And then towards the end of the game, as I gained more experience and I had more scripts for the AI, it increased in complexity. And by the end of the game, the computer is making strategic decisions based on decision maps and these grids that calculate kind of like the point value of each location on the map. So the AI in my game advances as you play through it, and kind of walks all the way from very beginning level AI to probably what a game strategy game developer would consider like just a medium. Mm-hmm. I'm a first time developer. There's no like advanced learning algorithms or anything like that.
At the most complex stage, what does the grid look like? Is it very complex? Is it large? How lengthy is it?
So the grid is the size of the play space, and my game is conveniently kind of grid oriented, like a board game. Mm-hmm. And so a big thing in Carrier Commander is about the gun coverage. So different ships have different guns, and the guns can shoot different distances. So an ideal positioning for your ship would be a place where your ship can shoot the most other ships while receiving the least fire itself. So the decision map in Carrier Commander takes every ship on the screen and it assigns it a value based on, is it about to die? How valuable of a ship is it? Does it have good guns on it? And then from that value, it also does another grid. There's like 4 grids it combines. So one is the value of the targets. The second grid is the threat level. So if I move to this square, how many ships will be shooting at me and how much damage will I take? And a third grid is the ship's ability to take out valuable targets. Mm-hmm. So it combines all these grids and it forms a fourth grid that just gives a point score for every single spot on the map for each ship. And from there, the computer can decide where's the best place to move the ship. Mm-hmm. And that's just for the ship movements. There's actually in the game, there's another mechanic of drawing a path for your airplanes from one carrier to the other. And that one's actually based on simple pathfinding. So it looks at the coverage of anti-air guns and it tries to draw a path around it or through the least amount of air coverage. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the AI in my game.
How'd you get to the point where you end up with 4 grids, though? So you're making the game, you have the concept for the game, you understand how the ships move, how the ships fire, and so on. You get to this problem. What does it look like coming to the solution of these 4 grids? How'd you learn to do that? Where'd you learn to implement this?
There is a fantastic article by Intel on artificial intelligence, which really completely educated me on AI. And I'll link to it below so anyone can read it. And the section in the third part of the article is on decision maps. So I researched decision maps, and decision maps are a great way to kind of give your AI entity working information that it can use as a computer that you can program to make decisions. So obviously the way a computer thinks and the way a person thinks are different. But one of the best ways you can emulate human decision making is with these decision maps. So through research, I tried a few things that we're going to talk about later, like finite state machines. And the thing that worked out best for a strategy game, and I ended up using the later levels, was these kind of grid-based decision maps. And you asked what they look like. So in the debugging mode, I would actually have an overlay of all the point values of the tiles. And it just, to see the game like the computer sees it, it's like an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers on it.
Sure.
Right? And then it chooses the highest numbered cell.
Right. That's pretty interesting. How much time do you think it took you to develop this solution for the AI? So you make it for one stage, you realize you got to make it for the next. I mean, if you can approximate like ballpark figure, how much of the game development or programming time went into just creating the AI?
Maybe 10 to 20% of the time. Because it's a strategy game that's the size of a mobile screen, the variety of the levels has to come from the computer using different strategies every time, because it can't come from like really unique levels in such a limited space. So I really tried to approach each and every level as its own separate AI. Sometimes I'd pre-program strategies in, which worked out well. But by the end of the game, because of the kind of branching possibilities that both you and the computer could take, you have to program a less kind of, you have to program a more dynamic AI without pre-constructed decisions. It has to make its own decisions, because as a developer, you have no idea what it's going to look like at the end if you have all these branching possibilities in your game. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Also, one thing which came to mind is that I know your game has a hard mode. Is the difference between normal and hard mode chiefly in the way that the AI responds to your activity, or are there other factors?
No, the hard mode is the original normal mode. And I figured out that normal mode was too difficult for people. So I made easy mode where I just nerfed the computer for everything.
I see.
So the hard mode is actually just fair.
Okay, I see.
And that kind of brings me to one of the first things I learned. I think you taught me this over WeChat, because I bragged one day. I said, hey guys, I wrote this AI level on my game and it beat me, and I'm so proud of my AI. And your comment was, yeah, but is it fun? And I was like, well, it's not really that fun to get beat by this master AI that just smashes me.
Sure. It reminds me of StarCraft. If you play against a StarCraft AI, it can be extremely difficult, but just not that much fun. As it turns out, the StarCraft AI is actually cheating. So that may be one of the reasons why it doesn't feel like a fair fight.
Oh, it must be cheating because of its has access to information that is covered by fog of war.
Precisely. That's exactly right. Yeah, and in StarCraft 2, they've corrected that situation so that now differing AI difficulty levels don't have that kind of access. So the AI does respond more like a human player. And it actually responds so much like a human player that they've had like world champion StarCraft players play against this AI under heavily scrutinized conditions. And the AI wins, which is not a shock. But AI has come a long way. I think StarCraft's a good example because your game's a real-time strategy game, an offline game. StarCraft, although it has an online mode, obviously it's also an offline real-time strategy game. So it has a lot of similar elements in terms of the way that enemy, ships and creatures respond to your activity.
Yeah, right. And, are we talking about a real AI or the game AI? Because nowadays they're programming real AI to play games, which is super cool.
Exactly. I think that's the difference. I mean, I'm not really that familiar with, how the AI has evolved through StarCraft 1 to StarCraft 2, because there's about, 15 years between those two games. And when the original StarCraft came out, which I think was 1998, obviously artificial intelligence was not really much of a buzzword at that time. That was so long ago. I mean, that was sort of before the, .com boom and bust. So quite a long time ago, but I know that StarCraft 2 now possesses some very, very advanced AI. And unfortunately, it has not lent much to the mainstream success of that game. But it is very complex from a strategy game perspective. So much so that it's a legitimate area of academic study.
What are some of your favorite AI you've encountered in games?
I was thinking about this question when you asked me this yesterday, and I think you answered the question for me. I think that the most interesting example of AI in games which I've ever played was in the Monolith title Shadow of Mordor, which is a game which takes place in the Lord of the Rings universe. I played it a couple years ago, came out on PlayStation 3 and then on PlayStation 4 also. And the best part of the game, by far, in my opinion, is what the developers called the Nemesis system. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Monolith, but they have like a very long history of developing some really top class AAA games. And they apparently consider themselves to be experts in the field of artificial intelligence.
Cool.
Yeah, and they wanted to push artificial intelligence in their game to a level which it had never been to before. And the way in which they did this, I think, really underscores the point which you make about artificial intelligence has to be fun before it's intelligent necessarily. And what their system does is sort of dynamically creates personalities, really believable, plausible personalities for computer-controlled NPCs in such a way that it very convincingly feels like you're playing against actual people with backgrounds and emotional content, and you really feel that they respond to you in the way that real people would. And it makes the game feel very dynamic, and kind of other games feel a little bit flat in comparison. When you're playing against NPC characters who are talking to you and reacting to what you're doing, in most games, it doesn't feel anything like a real person because they're sort of built with a script and they're acting in a predictable way, and it sort of unfolds in a sort of flat fashion. And the Nemesis system completely breaks that paradigm. So basically, you are hunting a number of these sort of orcs, and they all have names and personalities. They have accents. They have different physical mannerisms. The way in which they talk to you is all different. It's all very unique. And you're hunting these guys down, and you may encounter them on the battlefield. They see you. They address you. You have a dialogue with them. It's different every time. They must have recorded thousands of different verbal snippets, and they're combined in such a way that it just feels very lifelike. And what I noticed in particular, and a lot of reviewers and journalists took note of this as well, and it was considered one of the best games of the year when it came out, which I think was 2015 or so, is that when you're playing the game, if you encounter one of these AI-controlled characters and he kills you, then he's sort of taunting you, and he's gloating, and he's over your dead body, and he's like calling you names and making fun of you. And then you respawn, and then you encounter this same character again, and he responds to the previous situation which you had. So there's sort of a context for your relationship with these characters. So he says, I killed you last time. You want me to kill you again? And like you fight him again. Maybe he kills you again. And he's like, I'll come back a third time. I'll kill you a third time. And they respond in intelligent ways like that. And so you really feel some sort of grit about, I know this guy. You can feel it in your mouth. Like, I really just want to kill this guy. And it's very rare that I have felt that feeling of emotional reaction to computer controlled characters.
That kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with game AI should be a simulated player, because you'll notice you like that game not because the enemies are so intelligent and they're predicting your every move and beating you. You like it because they're relatable like people. It feels like you're playing with people.
Yeah.
That's a great example.
Another really interesting twist on this is that as you're engaged in sort of rivalries with some of these characters. Like, some of the most difficult ones will kill you repeatedly, and in some cases you kill them repeatedly as well. When you kill them, your character will like taunt them, and then later they'll come back and they'll be like, thought you killed me before, I'm back again, and it's like a growing rivalry. And one interesting twist on this is that if you have other players who are playing Shadow of Mordor, then they can confront the characters who have bullied you in the game, or vice versa.
Wow.
Like, I can encounter a character and it'll say, Ryan was killed by this guy like 4 times. And if I can defeat him, then both of us will get a bonus. And it sort of creates this social network effect with these artificial, characters, which feel very lifelike.
But are randomly generated, right? They're not scripted characters.
That's correct. And there are an infinite quantity of these characters. In the game, at any given point, you're interacting with a couple dozen of these. And they're ranked. There's a hierarchy of them. There are like war chiefs and different levels of enemies. So some of them are really valuable and really difficult. Some of them are low level and you kill them easily. So there's a whole cast of these guys. And in addition to this, there's also a more traditional, conventional narrative arc. So you're still doing missions. There's still story-based episodes which are unfolding in the traditional fashion that you would expect. There's a conclusion to the game, and the story is pretty good. Personally, I have zero interest in Lord of the Rings. I don't care about the lore of Lord of the Rings. I didn't watch any of the Hobbit movies, but I really enjoyed the game. The story's good, but what's really, really cool about the game is the Nemesis system. And I felt like I could pretty much play the entire game and just interact with these artificial intelligence characters and have that be a really satisfying game by itself. How about you? What do you think? When you think of artificial intelligence in games, are there any examples that are really stand out to you?
I really came unprepared with a great example. I can just say one that I appreciated recently.
Yeah.
Is in the forest.
Sure. That's a good example.
So in the forest, you encounter these cannibals, and at first they're just scary.
For anyone who's unfamiliar, explain what the forest is.
It's a open world survival game with a story arc. So unlike a lot of other survival games, it can end. It's
it's like a plane crash on a tropical island.
Yeah, you crash on this island, and you were traveling with this little boy who you see him get taken away by scary cannibals, and then you're kind of like looking for him and uncovering secrets about the island. And so as you encounter these cannibals, you start to realize that they have individual personalities that are dynamic. So you might encounter a group of them, and you kill one of them, and it turns out that the other one is like his life partner, and she starts crying and trying to drag his body away from you. And maybe she calls to her friends for help. And they just kind of have these like relatable group dynamics to these otherwise unrelatable, like half-human cannibal enemies.
Yeah, that's a good example. I remember playing The Forest, I think with you online, and seeing these unexpected reaction from these characters is really kind of emotionally troubling in some situations, kind of like you described. Like, you feel like you're being attacked, and so you have a weapon. It's a video game. You're kind of there to like defend, stand your ground, kill people, as you do in video games. And so you do. And then, a bystander who's one of these sort of tribal villagers, whoever he is, begins crying or runs away scared and shrieks. And you're like, oh, did I just do something wrong? Was I not supposed to do that? Because games generally sort of propagate the idea that you're supposed to kill the bad guys and you're glorified for doing that, and you get points and you get money and you get experience, and everything is sort of reinforcing this idea of, you know, perpetuating violence. And in the forest, sometimes it does do that, but other times it feels like, hey, maybe I'm the bad guy. And not knowing which of those outcomes is going to come is pretty interesting.
Yeah. And not to give any spoilers, because the forest has a great story, but maybe I'm the bad guy is a really important theme in the forest that continues.
Interesting. Yeah, I never even got to the end. But I remember, you know, the villagers kind of come to your camp at night or at day or whatever. They come in groups, and you can't communicate with them, so you don't really know what's going on. It's like, are they here to attack me? Are they here to communicate? Like, what's really happening? The feeling of not knowing what the context of the relationship is in the forest makes it a really unique game. And I think the artificial intelligence is one of the biggest contributors to convincingly creating that effect. You can't really predict how the people who approach you are going to act, can you? I mean, you can't. I didn't play the game more than 10 hours, but I felt like when people show up, you never really know.
Yeah, I remember the first time we got approached, it was scary. It was night. We had this fire in the middle of the woods. We didn't know where we were, and we just saw these kind of like something moving outside in the dark. And then they'd run up, and it's a person, and they're not attacking you. They're just kind of in your face looking at you and acting all skittish. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think we attacked first.
Sure.
I wonder if you could play that game and they're actually nice people if you just don't hit them with a rock.
Well, you know, I just figured like we have a spear or we have a rock or whatever, like let's go get them. You know what I mean? Like this is kind of how games always work. It's like I'm here to wreck things.
Yeah. Like I'm the good guy, but a couple minutes in and I'm eating people to survive.
That's a great game to check out. For anyone who hasn't played The Forest, that's a fantastic game to check out. I think it left early access last year in 2018. Is that correct? It's a complete game now?
Right. And they released a VR version, which I'm really excited about.
That would be pretty spooky. It's a very creepy game.
Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll cover part 2, the building blocks of game AI.